Good morning, and hope you guys are doing well. You might be morning where you are. It's morning where I am, so I'm going to say good morning. I hope everybody's doing well. Last week we had an election here in Virginia, pretty significant one. I don't know how much you paid attention to it. Some of you might have been old enough to vote in it. Most of you will be old enough to vote in the next election cycle, so it's something to pay attention to. For the first time in over a decade, Virginia voted Republican for statewide office, and not just once, but in all three major offices with governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general. So that's something to pay attention to because as Virginia lately has been more and more of what they call a blue state or a Democrat state, especially when you pay attention to national politics. We voted for Virginia voted for Obama twice, voted for Hillary Clinton when she ran against Trump, and voted for Joe Biden the last presidential election. So Virginia has been swinging more and more Democrat, but with this past election, that might be sending a message that to the Democrats are in charge that some of their policies might not be popular, that some of the things that they're doing isn't resonating with the American people. It's something to pay attention to over the next year because next year it's going to be houses in the Congress that are up for grabs. And so that's something that pay attention to because it wasn't just Virginia that had big swings towards Republicans. New Jersey lost a couple of delegates to the Republicans. I think Maine, the Republicans had gains there. Places like Seattle, which is notoriously a Democratic city, they voted a couple of Republicans into various offices. So this is, while these are local elections or statewide elections, nationally they make a significant message that you should pay attention to over the next course of the next year or so because are the national politicians going to pay attention to this? Are they going to pivot? Are the Democrats going to change how they approach some things? These are things to pay attention to because you, as an American citizen, you're going to be old enough to vote in that next election. So now is the time to start paying attention to what are the politicians doing, what are they saying, and how are things holding out there. So with that being said, there's my commercial to be a good citizen this week. We are talking about the executive office. That's what it looks like the quiz this week is going to be on, is the executive branch, specifically that of the office of President of the United States. The President of the United States is a very important office, and as we talk about this and talk about national elections and things like that, we need to sit there and say, what are we voting for? What is the job of the president? What is his role? What is he in charge of? What does he have the power to do? And who checks that power? Who keeps him in check? So what I want to do first and foremost is look at the role of the president. And there are five chief roles of the president of the United States. And notice I use that word chief because that word chief is going to be in each one of these roles. The first role is chief of state. Now, the president is not a monarch. He is not a dictator. He is not the only one in charge. We've been over this. You've been over this in government class. Should have had this in 8th grade civics class, that there's a balance of powers. The three branches hold each other in check. And so, therefore, the president is not an absolute dictator. He is not an absolute monarch. There are checks to his power. However, symbolically, he is the head of state. And so when there are meetings where the head of state has to be present and things like that, that's the president's job. He is the chief of state. So that's the first role, chief of state. The second role is the chief executive. The chief executive. In other words, he's the one who's executing the laws. He's the one who's appointing officials to different offices. He's the one who is able to grant reprieves and pardons. He is the chief executive. He is executing the law of the land to the best of his ability. Third role, commander in chief. He is in charge of all the military forces. He's the one who has say in what the military does, especially those powers increase, especially in times of war. The president is the chief or the commander in chief of the armed forces. He is the highest ranking official in the armed forces. Even if he was never in the military, as soon as he takes that oath of office, he is the commander in chief and in charge of the armed forces. For the longest time, it was very, very difficult to get a president elected who did not serve in the military. Obama broke that trend because he never served. Trump never served in the military. But for the longest time, that used to be a real obstacle for presidents or those wanting to become president, that they would have to jump over if they had never served. Because do you want somebody in charge of the armed forces that had never served in the armed forces? So that's a question there, because the president is the commander in chief. The president is also, the fourth role is the chief diplomat. Now, a diplomat or an ambassador is somebody that we send to represent our country. Well, who bigger to send than the United States? And so the president is the one who's the buck stops there. If he is sent in to negotiate with another country, that means this is the highest official that speaks for us, that represents us as the people. And so he is the chief diplomat. And the last role, and it might be confusing because we're talking about the executive office, is he is the chief legislator. Now, does this mean that the president makes law? No, it does not. However, what it does mean is that the president has the power to veto bills. Now, for a bill to become a law, it has to go through both the House and the Senate, has to win a majority vote in both House and Senate, and then it gets sent to the president. And the president can either sign it into law or he can veto it. If he vetoes it, then it goes back to the House and Senate, and it has to pass not by a majority, but by a 2/3 majority. And in other words, 66 senators have to vote for this, for it to pass, for it to override that veto. A veto is a very difficult thing to override. It can be done, and it has been done in the past, but it's traditionally a very difficult thing to overturn. And so in that sense, he is the chief legislator. He has the ability to veto bills that have been approved by House and Congress, and veto them and keep them from becoming law. He also has the ability to introduce new legislation. Now, he can't vote on it, he can't debate it, but he can introduce it into the House or into the Senate and say, this is what I would like to see done, this is what I would like to see voted on, I would like to see this bill come to the floor and be debated and things like that. And so in a lot of ways, he dictates the direction that Congress is going to take when it comes to making laws or introducing new laws into our society. Also, he works with Congress to establish a budget for our government to work by. Now, you don't have to be a genius to realize we're not always good at coming up with a budget or keeping that budget, but that does fall under the president's job description. And so those are the 5 chief roles of the president. Let me go over those once again. Chief of state, he is the chief executive, he is the commander-in-chief, he is the chief diplomat, and he is the chief legislator. So that is his roles. Now, what powers does he have? Well, according to Article 2 of the Constitution, the president has several powers. One we've already talked about. That's the power of veto. He has the ability to veto a bill that comes across his desk. And again, that veto can be overridden, but it takes a 2/3 majority of Congress to do so. He also has the power to command the armed forces. Again, that goes with the commander-in-chief that we've already talked about. He has the power to ask for the written opinion of his cabinet. We'll go over what his cabinet is here in a minute. But basically, his cabinet is a group of advisors, and he has the power to ask for a written opinion. Now, why would he want this? Well, let's say there's a piece of legislation that he really wants to introduce, and he wants to give it some authority or give it some validity. Well, to do that, he's going to ask experts that are hopefully on his cabinet and get a written opinion for him to submit to Congress or whatever else, saying this isn't just my opinion, this is the opinion of my cabinet, and therefore it can carry some weight in that way. He has the ability to convene or adjourn Congress. Now, usually this is done with the State of the Union address. He will convene Congress to have a State of the Union address where he will address what's going on in our country, and this usually happens once a year or so. There are other times that he can convene Congress. He can convene Congress to ask them to declare war. Franklin Roosevelt did this in World War II. He convened Congress after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. And he convened Congress and asked for Congress to declare war, which they did so. He has the power to grant reprieves or pardons. Again, that goes under that whole chief executive of executing the law, making sure it's carried out in a legal and just way. And he has the power to receive ambassadors. In other words, to host ambassadors at the White House to from other nations and to talk with them. That's part of his role as the chief diplomat. So there are several different roles that he has. There's several different powers that he has as president. And so what we're going to do now is kind of shift Wade here and see how does he go about his business. Who's around him? Who's helping him make decisions, all of these things. And so the first thing we're going to talk about is his cabinet. Now, the cabinet is a group of advisors that is there to advise the president. It is made up of the vice president plus 15 heads of executive departments. This would be the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of the Treasury. Those are all members of the cabinet. They're appointed by the president. So he's the one who gets to appoint these men to their or women to these positions. They have to be confirmed by the Senate, however, so there's that checks and balances. He can't just appoint anybody. It has to be confirmed by the Senate. And so the cabinet's going to change with each president. In fact, the cabinet serves as at the president's leisure, which means that at any point in time, he can dismiss them and reappoint somebody else to that position. So, but currently the way it sits is that it's the vice president and 15 heads of executive departments. Wasn't always the case. George Washington's cabinet was much smaller. And George Washington's cabinet did not have the vice president. The vice president had a different role back when Washington was elected president. But as it currently sits, it's the vice president plus 15 advisors, plus anybody else that the president might feel would contribute to that. I think Biden's cabinet is something like 25 people. And so you've got the vice president, these 15 heads of executive office, plus about 9 other people that sit in as advisors. And again, those 9 others, they can be appointed by Biden, but they have to be approved by the Senate. So it's not just anybody getting in there. The Senate does approve that. And what they do is they meet and they advise the president on different things. Each department head is hopefully an expert in their department. And so, for instance, Secretary of Defense is going to be advising the president on military matters. The Secretary of State is going to be advising the president on foreign matters and foreign relations. The Secretary of Finance or the Treasury is going to be informing him on budgetary concerns. So they each have a role. They each have an area of expertise that they can contribute there. And the president, there will be times where he'll sit there and say, I need to meet with these secretaries, and just meet with those particular few over whatever matter comes up. And so this is part of his advisory committee. So the president does this. Now, what's interesting is that the Constitution nowhere says that he has to have a cabinet. This has just been a tradition that George Washington had one. Where we get the term cabinet, it basically comes from the French word for a small room or a small private meeting room, and that's where they met originally, and so that's what it became known as, was the cabinet. But there's nothing that says he has to have one. But if he chooses to have one, then he has the power to ask for their written opinion. But there's nothing in the Constitution that says he has to have a cabinet. Every president has had one. Some have leaned on their cabinets more than others, but it just depends on the president and who they choose. And again, the cabinet has ranged in size from president to president. So That's one area that helps the president do his job. Another area is executive agencies. What are these? Well, these are independent agencies that deal with specific areas of the government, specifically areas that fall under the executive branch. These agencies will fall under the authority of either the president or one of the members of the cabinet, one of those 15 department heads. And so, some examples of executive agencies, these independent agencies that fall under the authority of the president or his cabinet. The Census Bureau, they fall under the Department of Commerce because, and the Treasury, because that's how we determine taxes, that's how we determine how things are, voting districts are divided, all of that. The Census Bureau is a executive agency. All of the military branches, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, the Coast Guard, all of those are considered executive agencies, and they fall under the Department of Defense. And so there you have, and of course the president is the chief or the commander-in-chief of those. And so there you have executive agencies. The Army is an executive agency. The Navy is an executive agency. Trump formed the Space Force, which is an executive agency. They all fall under the purview of the military, under the Secretary of Defense, the Department of Defense, the IRS. They're an executive agency. The Department of Treasury is in charge of them. So those are just some examples of executive agencies. This is how the president is able to do his job. He can't do everything. The president can't be sitting there being in charge of collecting taxes and running the military and on a daily basis and taking the census and do it. That's just too big of a job for one person. It's too big of a job for just one person plus the cabinet. You have to have these agencies, as large as our nation is, you have to have these agencies to go out and be able to do these jobs. And so one of the ways the president does that is through executive agencies. Now, as we talk about executive agencies, this leads us to another topic that your teacher put in the email for the quiz this week, and that is what's called the fourth branch of government. Now, you might be sitting there going, wait a minute, there's only three. There's the legislative, the executive, and the judicial. How are there four different branches of government? The fourth branch is an unofficial branch. And what it is, this is a term that is given to administration agencies within the government. The executive branch or executive agencies would fall under this, but because they are limited to the executive branch, that they're known as executive agencies. The fourth branch are agencies that they really are independent. They're established by Congress, but they have jobs that overlap the different branches of the government. Some examples of this, the CIA. That's an executive agency, or not executive. That's a member of the fourth branch. That's a independent administration or agency. The FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. The ATF is another one. Although they largely fall under the executive branch, they have other things that make them a fourth branch. What makes it fourth branch and not just executive branch is that these agencies are given power, one, to make their own rules. That's legislative power. So they make their own rules. In other words, the CIA makes its own rules as far as what they can do, what they can't do, because they're dealing with intelligence from foreign powers, from people that are potentially enemies of the state, things that deal with national security, all of that. And so they make their own rules, so that's legislative power. They enforce those rules, that's executive power. And if there are disputes within the agency or shortcomings within the agencies, they have the power to adjudicate or judge those disputes for themselves. And so that's judicial power. So they have three different powers of government there. Now, the concern is who keeps these agencies in check? If they have all of this power, who keeps them in check? Well, that's where a process called judicial review comes into play. If somebody within one of these agencies acts outside of the scope of the Constitution or violates constitutional rights or goes beyond the power that Congress gave them, then they are called in for a judicial review. And so there, and basically what that is, it can happen in one of two ways. They can be brought before a federal court, or they can be brought before a Senate committee. And so there you have the judicial branch on the federal level, plus the executive or the legislative branch on a federal level. Both of those act to check these fourth branch. Another popular term for the fourth branch that we use more often is the bureaucracy, because it's made of bureaus, Federal Bureau of Investigation. So the bureaucracy. And the larger the fourth branch gets, the more money that needs to be piped into it so that it can do its job. And this is why one of the big differences between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans typically, traditionally, now it hasn't been this way in the last probably 15, 20 years, but traditionally, the Republicans have wanted to shrink the bureaucracy, shrink the fourth branch, whereas Democrats traditionally want to expand it. So there you go. But that's what it is. So bureaucracy, the fourth branch of government, all of that, and so all these agencies that are there to help our government do their job. That's at least the purpose of them. Doesn't mean they always help, but that's the purpose of them. One of the things I talked about when we talked about the CIA was national security. What is national security? Well, national security simply is the means by which a nation secures its borders and guards national interest and protects both citizens and businesses that are based in that nation, whether at home or overseas. Okay, and so means by which a nation secures its borders, guards its national interest, and protects citizens and businesses both at home and overseas. And this is done through several means. One is through the military, and so that's where the executive branch comes in, our commander-in-chief, and so done through the military, done through embassies. What an embassy is, it is where our ambassadors stay when they are overseas. There are countries that have embassies here in America. We have embassies in other countries. That embassy is literally a piece of our country in another country. And in other words, if you go to France, let's just say you're in France and you decide to visit the American embassy in France, as soon as you are within the property lines of that embassy, according to international law, you are technically on United States soil. And therefore, as soon as you're on embassy property, all the rights that you have as an American citizen are active right then and there. You can't be arrested by French authorities there. They would have to go through the process of extradition and all those things. So, but embassies are where the ambassador for our country to that country live. It's where their offices are, all of those things. So national security is done through military, through embassies, through intelligence. That's the Central Intelligence Agency that we were talking about, and things like that. So that's national security. Why is this important? Well, because the president has the power to issue orders that might skirt the law or the rights of some, if he can prove that it is a matter of national security, that if I don't do this, our nation as a whole will be in danger. And so this is why President Bush, after 9/11 and those attacks, he was able to enact a lot of laws that violated a lot of rights that we have as citizens in the interest of national security. That's how he framed that. Now, whether or not you agree with that or not, that's a different debate. But that's how he was able to do it, was by claiming this is a matter of national security. National security can be invoked when presidents or governments are trying to limit what the press is saying. The press can't print this because if they print this, it can really damage our national security. And so, there's that First Amendment right, the freedom of the press. But the freedom of the press is limited if national security is at stake. So all of those things come into play, and that's why it's important. Now, What happens if something happens to our president that incapacitates him? Or if our president falls ill and dies in office, or if he resigns because he's no longer able to carry out his duties, or worst case scenario, and we hope this doesn't happen, but worst case scenario, somebody assassinates the president. Who takes charge? Who comes into play? And how is this determined? Well, Article 2 of our Constitution introduces the idea of secession. And the idea of secession is simply this: if something happens that incapacitates the president, there is always somebody next in line to take office, to be sworn in as the next president. Now, through various acts and amendments later, we have what is called the line of secession. And Article 2 simply said the vice president. After that, it was realized, well, what if something happens to both of them at the same time and there's some national emergency or something like that? And so this is a safeguard to ensure that there is somebody always, quote unquote, next in line. And so the line of secession is as follows. Okay, so something happens to the president. He's incapacitated. He cannot do his job. He cannot fulfill his duties. Somebody has to step up into that office. The first person, of course, is the vice president. This is how it's always been. The vice president is the next one up. As they often say in the media, this person's a heartbeat away from the office. And so the vice president. But what happens if something happens to the vice president? Well, the next person is the Speaker of the House. So whoever is the Speaker of the House is the third, or is the second person in line. So you have Vice President, then you have the Speaker of the House. This is why so much emphasis is put on who has the majority in the House, because whatever party has the majority in the House, they choose the Speaker of the House. And so Vice President, Speaker of the House. Then the person in line after them is an office we talked about last week when we talked about the legislative branch. That is the President pro tempore of the Senate. Of the Senate. The President of the Senate, of course, is the Vice President, but as we talked about last week, there's a president pro tempore that would step in if the vice president can't be there. And again, that is chosen by whoever's the majority of the Senate. And so right now, with Biden in office and the Democrats having control of both House and Senate, the line of secession for vice president to the Speaker of the House, to the President pro tempore, that's all Democrat. But that's not always going to be the case. There have been times where you've had presidents that were of one party and the Speaker of the House was a different party. Yeah, there have been times where the president's been one party and the President pro tempore of the Senate's been another party. So it's not always a guarantee that it's always going to stay within party. Right now, that's the case. After next year's election, when the houses when the seats in the House of Representatives change up, who knows? But right now, that's the way it sits: President, Speaker of the House, President pro tempore of the Senate. Well, what about after that? What if something really, really tragic happens? In fact, there was a TV show on several years ago called Designated Survivor, where during the State of the Union address, a terrorist sets off a bomb and blows up all of Congress and everything else like that. And all of these people died. Most of the president's cabinet died. Who is the next president according to the Constitution? Well, according to the Constitution, after you go through the president, the Speaker of the House, the President pro tempore of the Senate, after that, you start with members of the cabinet by seniority. Not seniority of the person serving, seniority of how long has that been in position in the cabinet. And so that means that the fourth in line is the Secretary of State. That's the longest serving cabinet member, or the longest serving office in the cabinet. So it goes Secretary of State, and then it goes in order of which position in cabinet is the oldest. If you're wondering how that would follow with some of these that came about at the same time, it's Secretary of State, followed by Secretary of Treasury, followed by the Secretary of Defense, followed by the Attorney General, all the way down. So that is the line of secession. After that, if something really, really, really wrong has happened, if you get to that point, then I believe it starts with the Senate, and it starts with the longest serving senators first. But that gives you an idea of the line of secession. And I mean, by the time you get through the cabinet, there's 15 people on the cabinet. So by the time, like I said, something really, really bad has happened. Hopefully we never, ever see anything remotely close to something that bad happening. But there is a line of secession. There's always somebody next up. And that way, if something tragic happens to the president, we're not in a panic going, oh, we need to have another election. We need to do this. We need to do that. No, there's somebody right there. And we've seen this happen throughout our history. There have been presidents that have been assassinated. Abraham Lincoln, John F. Kennedy. There have been presidents that were incapacitated. Ronald Reagan, when he was, somebody attempted to assassinate him and he was hospitalized for a few days. We've seen this happen where the president has been incapacitated or unable to fulfill his duties, or he resigns in office like Richard Nixon did. Nixon resigned. Immediately, the vice president takes the oath of office and he serves as president. And the 25th Amendment is there to show that the vice president can do this for a temporary period. For instance, when Reagan was shot and was in the hospital and was unable to perform his duties for a temporary bit of time while he was recovering, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush's father, he served as president in that time period as a temporary position, but he was able to do that. And so that the idea of secession is found in Article 2. There have been several different acts and amendments added to the Constitution to define further what that is and how that works. But again, that's there to keep somebody always in charge, somebody always there to do that. So this leaves us with executive orders. What are executive orders? Well, executive order is a signed, written directive by the President of the United States that helps manage the operations of the federal government without having to go through Congress. Now, an executive order can be found to be unconstitutional. Federal judges can put a stop to it if they have a concern about it. But many presidents from both parties have used executive orders in order to get stuff done. Anybody who's ever been in charge of something knows that once you get so many people involved, it takes a while to get stuff done. And if all you got to do, you don't even have to be an expert or somebody who's paying a whole lot of attention. You know that Congress is constantly fighting with each other. The stuff takes forever to get through Congress sometimes. Sometimes the president is like, look, stuff needs to be done. Let's take the pandemic, for instance. When the pandemic hit, we don't have time to sit here and wait for mandates or whatever else to go through the debate of Congress and everything else. You need somebody in charge that's able to sit there and say, nope, this is how it's going to be done. Let me write an executive order. Governors, governors for states are kind of like what the president is for the United States. They're the chief executive of the state. A lot of governors through the pandemic have used executive orders to, whether it's been for wearing masks, whether it has been for saying when restaurants and movie theaters and things like that can be open or not open, limiting crowd sizes, all of those things. Now, you can agree with those orders, you can disagree with them, you can talk about whether they have the right to do them. The fact is, federal courts have been very, very, very reluctant to step in and override any executive orders. The exception has been when they apply to churches. The federal courts did step in because the state of New York, state of California, both were trying to limit what churches could do, and were, in some cases, you could argue, were unfairly targeting churches as far as being able to gather together and meet or whatever else, even if those churches were following all the rules. And the federal government stepped in, or the federal judges stepped in and said, nope, this violates the First Amendment. You can't do that. So that's been the exception during the pandemic. But for the most part, the federal courts have stayed out of it. They have let governors do, if you want a mask mandate, we're not going to step in and override that. You want to mandate how many people can be in a building, we're not going to step in and override that. You want to mandate who can go in a restaurant, whether you want to sit there and regulate that they have to be vaccinated or not. And again, we can argue about this, we can debate this. You might have an opinion that's different than somebody else's, but the executive order is there so stuff gets done, and done quickly. And now, again, if it's found to be unconstitutional, federal courts will step in and they will override these orders, and that has happened on the presidential level with presidential executive orders. In fact, Biden issued an executive order for trying to mandate vaccinations for all companies of a certain size or larger, and the federal court has stayed that. They're going to review it. In other words, what they've said is you can't enact this order until we look at it and see whether this is in violation of the Constitution or not. And so that executive order, it hasn't been overturned yet, but it's unable to be enforced right now. And so that's just one example of the judicial branch checking the executive branch, because whenever we start talking about executive orders, everybody gets all up in arms and saying, oh, especially if they don't like the president that's in there, or if the president that's in office is not the one they voted for, then they will complain about the executive orders and say that he's ruling like a tyrant and we're a democracy and yada, yada, yada. Every president, Republican and Democrat, has issued executive orders. And the judicial branch has always stepped in when those orders are overstepping their boundaries. So if you see a president enacting executive orders, you might disagree with those orders. You might not like those orders. Those orders might be inconvenient to you as a citizen. However, the judicial branch will do its job if it needs to. And there's no reason to worry about, our democracy is failing because the president has issued so many executive orders. Doesn't mean that you have to agree with all of them. There have been executive orders that from presidents, again, from both parties, that I didn't like, but I trust the judicial branch to do its job and to check the executive powers. So I think that's everything that was on this week's email. I think we covered everything. And like I said, mostly deals with the president, his job, his powers as president. He is the figurehead of our country. He is nicknamed the ruler of the free world. I think that's a hilarious nickname considering he's checked by the judicial branch and the legislative branch. But then that's the nickname we give him. Hope this helps. Hope you guys do well. Study up. Watch this video. Pause it. Take notes. Whatever you need to do. Until next week. See you. Take care of yourselves. Bye.